Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the 40th meeting of the Advisory Committee on Supply Chain Competitiveness. Many of you have seen or talked to me in the past. My name is Richard Bohl. I'm the DFO, or the designated federal officer for this advisory committee. Basically, just puts me in a position of running the committee with people in our office. So we appreciate all the hard work that you guys do. And as I was stating, we look forward to this meeting because we've heard of a lot of the work that's being done in the subcommittee. So we look forward to see the works of your labor on those recommendations. So we look forward to that later. And I just need a little housekeeping stuff. I'd like to remind everyone that this meeting is open to the public and will be transcribed and videotaped. And also just to make Zoom run a little more smoothly, I guess, we're trying to ask the ACSCC members to use their video and mute their line unless they are speaking. And for the participants, please do not use the video and mute your line too until you have a speaking, unless you're asking a question or speaking. And lastly, when you do speak, please mention your name and your affiliation, your organization, so that we can know who is talking at the time. And also for people that looks like we don't have any call-ins, so I won't bring that into play yet. And again, I want to thank everybody for all their hard work that's been going on since our last meeting in January, and look forward to hearing that. And also just a touch base, we'll be talking about maybe October 12th is our next meeting. So with that, I would like to bring it over to Eugene Alford. He's the Acting Director of Office of Supply Chain Professional and Business Services. And so Eugene, please take it away.
Thank you, Rich. Ladies and gentlemen, as Rich noted, I'm Eugene Alford, the Acting Director of the Office of Supply Chain Professional and Business Services. I've had the pleasure of working with a number of you for the first time over the past several months since the ACSCC was reconstituted, and some of you have worked with our office and committee for many years. To all of you, thank you for your time and service in working to improve the competitiveness of America's supply chains. I would like to take this time to thank Rich Bohl, the ACSCC's designated federal officer, for his diligence and perseverance over the course of the past 6 months. Through Rich's efforts, the ACSCC has been reconstituted. New members have been brought on board. 3 subcommittees have formed, and each has held numerous meetings. And now we are holding the second full committee meeting this year, with excellent speakers from across the U.S. government, including Secretary Raimondo and Deputy Secretary Graves. None of this would have happened without sustained quality from Rich. I would also like to recognize the other members of our supply chain team that have been working behind the scenes to make today happen. So thank you to Caroline Kaufman, Francis Veras, and Russell Adiz. With that, I would like to turn the meeting over to our ACSCC co-chairs, Ursula Burns and Jeff Wilkie. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm opening this portion of the session, and Jeff will follow me. I'm Ursula Burns. I am the vice chair of the ACSCC, and I'm very pleased to be here. I want to add my thanks to all of the people in the government structure, Gene Alford, Richard Bohl, the secretary, the deputy secretary, and all of the people who have been supporting and helping the committee and the subcommittees in their work. I'm sure I missed someone, but I apologize. As I said, I'm Ursula Burns. I am the chairperson of a CEO advisory firm called Teneo, and I'm a founder of a private equity firm called Integrum. And when I was asked to be involved with this, I jumped at the chance because I see in the work that I do with Teneo, working with CEOs, large company CEOs and small company CEOs, I hear continuously about some of the challenges that they face in business today, everything from inflation to the war in the Ukraine, and very surprisingly and very consistently, discussions about the supply chain and the challenges that the supply chain are presenting, a lack of resilience or lack of flexibility are presenting to business today. And and the need for help and a focus in this area. So I think it's a great area to be working in and on, and I'm pleased that I've been asked to be engaged. We have 3 subcommittees that you'll hear from in a moment. The first subcommittee is on data innovation and technology. It's led by Dr. Hao Lee. He's a professor at Stanford University. Second subcommittee is with Revathi Avathi. She's the CEO of Flex, and she's on manufacturing competitiveness. And then the third subcommittee is Jean Soroka, who's working on freight movement, policy, and infrastructure, and that leading that subcommittee. These 3 sub-chairs, co-chairs, or subcommittee chairs, I'm sorry, are the individuals who have really put most of the work into, all of the work into the recommendations that you'll hear from them and the work that we're doing. The importance of the ACSCC, I think, comes out in 2 ways. The software side is on just working public to private partnership and working together, business and government, to solve problems and address opportunities is something that we have to continue to practice to do. In the United States, it'll help us to be a better and a more competitive companies and also government. Also, companies learning from other companies in these subcommittee dealings, we found that to be also a very positive side benefit, which is good and will continue as we go forward. The hard benefits you'll see from the recommendations of the subcommittees. We'll have 2 of them that will have recommendations and a status report from the third. So I think all good, and I'm looking forward to the meeting, the rest of the meeting today. I am going first before Jeff because I am in the UK right now and heading off to a meeting that starts in a little while, so I will not be at the close of this session, but my not being here does not dampen at all my dedication to this activity. Next, I'll be introducing Andrew Patrician, he serves as a supply chain advisor for the United States Department of Transportation. He is building the administrative and policy backbone for both the short-term goods movement chain and the long-term policy, organizational, and administrative changes necessary to reshape the country's goods movement systems to be more efficient and more resilient. Prior to his time at the US DOT, he worked on infrastructure project development, procurement, and finance with state, local, and federal agencies. Andrew graduated from the University of Notre Dame with a Bachelor's of Science degree in civil engineering. And I'm looking forward to his presentation. But before that, I want to hand it back to Jeff. He will provide his introduction of himself and introduce the second speaker before Andrew speaks. So Jeff, over to you.
Thanks, Ursula. And thanks to everyone who's here. Ursula did a great job of listing off all the people who worked so hard to get to this point. My name is Jeff Wilkie. I joined Amazon in 1999 to lead the build out of its global operations and supply chain. I've spent over 30 years studying, building, and optimizing global supply chains across a number of industries. Over the last 2 years, I co-founded a company helping to rebuild American manufacturing. I was quick to say yes when Secretary Raimondo asked me to join this committee, because I believe the strength of our country depends critically on our economy, including our supply chain and the manufacturing plants it feeds and supports. Good paying jobs matter, industries that create value robustly matter, and I think manufacturing and supply chain contribute among the highest combinations of both. And without them, the United States is beholden to any nation state who have focused on these areas. Our committee's objective is to gather experts from business, labor, academia, and government to examine deeply this complicated system that moves physical goods from manufacturing locations around the world, including increasingly here in the US, to homes, businesses, governments, and nonprofits across our nation. The system's complicated. As we've seen in the last few years, there are no easy fixes when disruptions are large enough. Neither government nor industry possesses a simple dial to adjust to the perturbations the world throws at us, from war to public health crises to political instability to weather. Though there isn't one dial, it is a system built by humans, and all systems have bottlenecks. I've long argued that you have an operating strategy when you decide where you want the bottleneck to be. It seems for the last few years, the bottleneck has surprised us. It's revealed itself to us almost by surprise. The job of our committee is to characterize this system, reduce the surprise, decide where we want the bottlenecks to be, and propose changes for government and industry that will allow us all to increase supply chain performance and resilience. Work to date has been performed mostly by our subcommittees, as Ursula highlighted. They are, of course, building on work by prior incarnations of this committee, as well as current work occurring across government, industry, and academia, and you'll hear about some of that today. Our recommendations presented to Secretary Raimondo and team today include concrete steps we can implement now, actions that will take some time to organize, and ideas for further work. We expect our subcommittees to continue to meet and to work on this important challenge. I'd like to thank the subcommittee leaders and members for their diligent work over the last few months, which included more than 20 individual subcommittee meetings and lots of work by supporting teams along the way. I've attended many of those subcommittee meetings, and I've been extremely impressed with the amount of hard thought, hard work, and time invested by each subcommittee member. Now I'll welcome Andrew Petrason. He'll be followed by John Young from the Federal Maritime Commission. John's an experienced national policy director, Maritime Shipping Council, and advocate with a demonstrated history of articulating the federal investment needs of the maritime, ports, and surface transportation industries. But first, Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, Andrew Petrason, Supply Chain Advisor at USDOT. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and walk through a presentation of what we're doing on flow at the department and with many of the folks on this call as well, and hopefully leave some time for questions. So I want to walk through really three things today. Kind of one, what is flow first and foremost? Two, what are the benefits of participating, in a kind of government industry partnership like we're trying to build? And importantly, what is the unique value that the federal government can provide here, right? I'm very aware that we are not kind of an owner or operator, many of the supply chain, much of the supply chain. So this has kind of been a North Star for us, is how are we providing real value? What is the federal government able to do here that private capital, isn't already, taken care of? And three, kind of importantly, what is next? So, what is flow? There's a few principles that we've kind of following. One, it is a fully voluntary national exchange of kind of operational freight information amongst parties across the supply chain. Two, the analysis is really only available to stakeholders who participate and share data, importantly. And three, it must be sustained by the kind of commercial and operational benefit to the private parties themselves. This is happening kind of on a voluntary basis. What are the kind of outcomes that we expect and are kind of driving towards? One, really it is kind of the optimal balance between supply and demand of a kind of national logistics system more broadly, by doing two things. One, providing kind of an independent indicator of health of the supply chain, and two, kind of a preview for performance for operational planning. We'll get kind of more into detail of this as we go on. But I also want to mention what flow is not, which is really important. It's not like a cargo tracking or visibility tool. We spoke with folks across the country and believe private sector and private capital are taking care of this amongst chains of kind of contracted parties, right? We're talking about measuring demand against supply at key nodes, aggregating and de-identifying that information. It's also not a formal standard setting process. So we're not kind of setting industry standards for container movement events. There will be kind of a formal way and clearly identified data fields and elements that are shared as part of this, but we're not setting standards for container movement events. So kind of as analogous, think more of like the health indicator comparison as like the CPI, right? This is a kind of federally, federal index, right? That is indicator of health of the broader economy. And for an operational comparison, again, it's not, none of these are perfect, but the FAA has done for 30 years around collaborative decision making. So working with airports, airlines, to kind of manage essentially capacity of national airspace. And in short, right, is an independent indicator of health, to inform operational decisions. So that's at the high level. And I'll dive into kind of some more of the details here around benefits of participating. All right, so first, kind of indicator of health of the supply chain. So we're aggregating demand, oversupply at key nodes. We're defining supply by kind of terminal, marine or rail currently. And to simplify, this is what we're doing, right? You're taking aggregate units of demand over aggregate units of supply, and you'll compare that to performance, right? And we'll kind of get to that in a second. And we're starting with really three kind of sub-calculations as part of this. What we're calling a flow waterside index. You're aggregating demand at a node, so incoming container volume over aggregate terminal supply. So, available container slots, total container slots. Flow landside index, the same aggregate demand over an aggregate drayage supply or chassis supply. So these are kind of actual available assets and units, within the kind of region of the node, and a kind of flow regional index. So again, the same demand, incoming container volume against aggregate, warehouse supply over the road supply. There's a volume, in this one, you have to make kind of a volumetric conversion for warehouse, but we can kind of, that's a bit in the weeds. So the kind of pilot nodes we've been working with are LA and Long Beach, global container terminals at New York, New Jersey, as well as the Port of Savannah. So we're talking about the data fields and elements themselves, which we're, kind of refining with some of the folks on this call who are a part of Flow, and appreciate, this isn't possible without, equal participation of both public and private sectors. We're talking about, BCO's purchase order information. So you're getting a very early, demand signal aggregated and de-identified amongst parties who are a part of this. And for the ocean carriers and NBOCCs, booking information, right, coming in, at the nodes that we've defined. On the supply side, talking about, available, container slots, talking about total chassis serving a terminal, again, aggregating assets of units of supply, again, total drayage trucks serving a terminal, available in total warehouse space, and total trucks in a defined region from an OTR standpoint. So these are the data fields. Again, we're kind of, refining these a bit more, but this is what we're looking at in terms of kind of a, sharing into a common exchange. Here's some of the folks we're working with right now. It's kind of initial group. This group will grow, but kind of is broadly representative of supply chain parties, from warehousers to truckers to ports, terminals, chassis providers, BCOs, ocean carriers, etc. And kind of where are we able to uniquely, provide value here to aggregate this index? One, the department and the federal government, just as we talked about with BLS providing a CPI, is an independent steward of information, right? We're providing kind of statistical analysis, but really, nothing beyond that. There's central location for kind of one, view of measuring supply and demand. Broader demand visibility beyond an individual, network of kind of demand that you have, and deeper visibility kind of starting with purchase orders. And I think importantly, we are aggregating units of supply in near time, right, as a measure of kind of supply. So we're not using kind of historical performance for capacity. So we're not looking at like dwell, at a particular terminal. We're aggregating kind of actual units of supply, right? And there's not really a commercial incentive to do that if you're kind of a supply provider. So we have an index now of aggregate units of demand over aggregate units of supply. That in and of itself is interesting information, but becomes more useful when we think about what it means for a performance preview. So again, back to where we started, we're taking an aggregate demand over an aggregate supply. So every day, right, you're producing an index that will be, 1,500 containers over 1,000 trucks, 1.5, right? You're producing that every day from the federal side. So we are here on the left side of this table. This is primarily our role, right? We need to produce a comprehensive and representative index of demand units over supply units. What we can then do, and really what the private sector participants will do, is you can build a relationship from that demand over supply to performance, right? So at a particular index, so if we have 1,500 containers and 1,000 trucks, right? What does that mean in terms of performance of the node, right? So you're building a relationship between, the aggregation of assets in the numerator and denominator to any performance metric that, you're using as part of your business, or, we can take, broadly, street dwell, terminal dwell, things like that, and begin to build that. And what you get, right, is I'm just taking that table and kind of putting it into a chart, is you're building the relationship between that independent index, right, that we can provide as a federal government, and performance measurements around a particular node, in the supply chain, which, becomes kind of a broader indicator of economic health, but that's maybe a bit of a separate conversation. So again, if you have, a flow index of 1.2, over time, you begin to build that relationship, and we'll start with historical information so we can kind of build these internally to test. And again, you're building a relationship between independent index and kind of any measure of performance, right, on the y-axis. And what you can begin to do then, what we're testing with this group of partners is, so this right here, this is all illustrative. This is, and as is this, these are all kind of numbers I'm just using to kind of illustrate the concept. So if you look at, gray being the kind of demand signal, this is the current date. And this is actual supply. So we'll say this is the amount of trucks on a particular day that are available to serve the node. And then this is just a kind of a moving average of that supply moving forward. If you look out 7 days, right, you see the flow index is 1. You have a preview of what that performance will be based off the relationship that we've built historically between the total number of assets of demand or the total number of assets of supply. And again, if you look out further, you can see if the flow index is 1.3 because we've got these two numbers where, this is a kind of just using calculation. You can again correlate that to what a performance of a particular performance metric might look like. I'm using dwell broadly just to, again, prove the point. So you are kind of looking at a preview of performance. Again, our role on the federal side is to provide the index, right? And you can compare that to any performance metric to build that relationship. And, why we think this is important. So if we look at, I'm using Port of Long Beach numbers, right? So this is last fall, where you see performance deterioration start to kind of drop off, as we all saw, right, nationally. That is kind of a, I consider a lagging indicator, right? When we look at something like dwell, right, it's a lagging indicator of the problem. Dwell, if we see dwell now is going up, there was an issue before. And what we're trying to really get at here is if we're comparing units of supply to demand, we think we'll get a precursor to this chart. And that precursor will give participants kind of earlier insight to act, right? And to make, decisions around optimizing the supply chain. I'd mention as well, just going back quickly here, the unique piece of this as well. So you have a flow index of 1.3, right? In the kind of, at a unit level basis, like how many trucks or, what other, supply you would need to obviously make the index change as we're looking ahead for a planning purpose. We are kind of now starting from a kind of data submission standpoint with some of our kind of initial partners. We're starting with historical information to kind of build out the indexes, which is really a math problem more than anything else. So we can kind of test and poke the system and see kind of what this will build. And kind of simultaneously working on kind of a data submission infrastructure, which is more of an IT problem, for kind of daily or weekly reporting. And we're kind of working individually with folks on what, that would look like. What's next? BTS is kind of, beginning to work with sample data from participants. We're signing MOAs with folks. We kind of have a pilot website where folks can get accounts and kind of build, submit information. And I use the word, I'm a structural engineer actually by training, as mentioned. So, we have a load bearing structure, so we have something a bit, probably in a month or so, begin to kind of add more members and more data. But we really want to prove out the kind of analysis first with a kind of a limited set of participants. In the long term, we really want to build the type of kind of government industry collaboration, that we've seen, before. Again, I'm using kind of FAA's CDM as an example, that helps manage the kind of demand and capacity, or demand and supply national airspace system, looking at this from kind of a logistics standpoint as well, and to provide private sector the information, additional information, to make decisions. As a recap, and I'm happy to kind of talk and discuss and ask questions. We think this is kind of a unique federal government role, right, to support supply chain operations, both in being able to kind of aggregate these units of supply and demand, de-identify them and push them back out for participants. I think this really captures and kind of institutionalizes the spirit of collaboration that was started by the Supply Chain Disruption Task Force. And I think, it helps us, will help us build kind of long-term global leadership in supply chain. And I think, the term I've been using lately is, commercially competitive, but kind of operationally cooperative supply chain moving forward. So hopefully we have time for questions. I tried to get through this fairly quickly. And let me see if I can stop sharing the screen, then we'll be good to go. Sorry, here we are. Great. So happy to take questions, thoughts, comments, kind of what we're building.
Andrew, this is Barbara Melvin with the South Carolina Ports Authority. How are you?
Good. How are you? Great to see you.
Nice to see you as well. I really enjoyed that. That's the first presentation I've seen on flow, so thank you. Just a couple of questions. I noticed the absence of rail. Is that something that you're going to add in later?
We'd love to have rail partners, and we're speaking with them, and would welcome them joining the group. So.
And then secondarily, do you think some predictive analytics like lifts from Asia or Europe into the United States can give you some better data as you were understanding ship arrivals or ship delaying their arrivals, because that certainly has downstream impacts on chassis availability if exports are sitting on chassis, etc. Is that all information that you're gathering as well?
We're starting with the kind of initial set that we showed. I think that will expand over time. But we're looking at, I know we've talked to and the State Department's been interested in kind of working internationally as well. But the kind of current nodes are defined domestically, and I'd love for it to go. I'd love for it to be international. But I think we'll make sure we have, again, the kind of load bearing structure first domestically.
Great.
And then go from there. But appreciate, those are really helpful questions and comments.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Jason.
Thanks, Andrew.
Key member of Flow. So.
Yep, and also on the data subcommittee, and so that's where I'm going to kind of tie these two together. Once the data is up and running, I know one thing that we've discussed both at Flow and in our data subcommittee of this committee is the response, right? How do we use the data in both a public and private way and get agencies and private industry coordinated in the response? Do you anticipate that that's a function of Flow, or would you look to this supply chain committee to kind of stand up that response piece once the visibility and data is up and running?
Yeah, I think that's definitely in the plans. I know, like, we've heard that from a number of folks in terms of, like, we have now are building, I think, a real culture of cooperation and collaboration among supply chain parties that's driven by what we're doing. And there's, there's one way to think about it that's like, here's information, continue to go operate how you have been. But we've definitely heard from folks both within that we're kind of working directly with on Flow, but also externally, like, potentially kind of desire to provide the kind of collaborative environment, which is, what the FAA kind of does with, or not kind of, they do with collective decision making. I think like we'd love to engage this group to think about how that might kind of unfold and play out. And I think that becomes again, Jason, to your point, like a successor topic, once the kind of index is, we have a kind of trusted and representative index.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, Rich, this is Jeff Wilkie. Andrew, thanks for that. It's a great update, and love the attempt at rigor in a very complicated system. I'd love to get a little bit more characterization of the way you're thinking about throughput through the nodes. So can you tell us a little more about how you define supply? For example, in a port, is supply simply the supply of crane hours? Is it, what else? It could be other things, but I assume you want to know the supply of bottleneck resources, other resources that may have more capacity don't really matter.
Yeah, so we're looking at, it's a great question. We're looking at like on the supply side. So demand is bookings and purchase orders, right? On the supply side, we're really not, we're not looking at, we're looking at like available assets, right? So like at at the port of LA, on a given day, how many drayage trucks are available, right, to pick up to pick up containers, less so the performance of those assets. When we're talking about like throughput, to me is the kind of, right, that's the kind of y-axis to the x-axis that we're building. So if you have aggregation of assets on both the supply and demand side, you could compare that to throughput and see if there's a given number of demand units, supply units, like this is the throughput that is like expected, right? Or here's the throughput that you kind of are previewing into the future. So we're not kind of taking in directly performance information as much as that's the thing that we're planning to compare it against, if that makes sense.
I see. I'm happy to talk more about this. We can do it offline.
Yeah.
But thanks for that. Super helpful.
Yeah, happy to talk more offline. Willie?
Yeah, just one observation, Andrew. I think this is terrific, but if you have, for example, the kind of dwell time between nodes, okay, or some, it's like two of the three. If you have two of three parameters, like the throughput time, the inventory accumulation between nodes, and the output rate or the processing, any two of those will define the third, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing because you're looking at multiple nodes there.
Yeah, so I would expect, I guess, maybe is what you're getting at, Willie, like we'll take the regional index, which is focused on warehouse and OTR, that will impact performance measures on the terminal, right? Like these aren't like the indexes as we've defined them, like won't just impact the assets that are a part of the direct calculation, I think is what you're getting at. Yeah, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of potential if you can, if you have two pieces of the data, it'll give you the third, right?
Yeah.
So Andrew, thanks very much for this update. I think you have given us update before to our subcommittee, and we learned quite a bit from you. Thank you. I think Flow is a fantastic project. It's a very, very good off to a good start. I would like to follow up with Willie's point. I think we should look at logistics data from two aspects. One is what happened at a node. which is what you're doing already. Yeah, so is the node congested? Is the node capacitated? How many containers are waiting? So these are, I call it, what happened at the node. But then what happened between nodes is also very important later, right? Between nodes. So if I need to do transshipment from Long Beach to, let's say, New Orleans port, so how long does it take to get there? Or if it's a rail from a particular city, from Los Angeles to Chicago, now you have node information, but then eventually the dwell time between nodes would be also very useful potential indexes, because that could also guide 3PLs and companies to say, hey, yeah, this dwell time is getting out of hand, or something is wrong, maybe not enough trucks, or maybe not enough rail cars. And so I think that this connectivity between nodes would give us dwell times. So it's both the stock information and the dwell times that could be very useful.
Yeah, no, we've talked about, maybe kind of a, limited set of performance metrics that, we could kind of intake on the public side. So dwell times is definitely one of those metrics that we've been evaluating. Thank you.
Any other questions for Andrew? I guess not.
Great. Well, in any case, thank you everyone for again the invitation to present to you all, and I'm happy to talk offline with any of you all about additional questions, comments, feedback. We're excited to have people be a part of this and to build something that we think is novel. So really appreciate your time and your insights, and looking forward to working with you all.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. Hey, before we go to the next presentation, I just wanted to ask, I got some comments about the screen view of Andrew's presentation. Is everyone getting that okay? Okay, everyone's got to see it. Okay,
Yes.
just making sure. I think there was one or two people that it looked a little strange on their screen, so we're all good with that. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Carry on, Jeff, I guess. Just want to make sure.
Okay, I think our next speaker is John Young from the Federal Maritime Commission. John?
John.
John, I see John's. It's not, John, we can't hear you if you're talking. Let's see, he was there and then got off. Hold on.
Did we just lose him?
All right, looks like we did. Let's see.
Well, modern technology is not perfect. Let's give him a sec. Hey, everyone. I just got done talking to John. He had another computer that wasn't working. He couldn't hear anybody. So he's using a different computer to log on. So he'll be on in a sec.
Great.
He should be on any second.
I'm not sure we should fill the dead space with supply chain humor, but this is an example of a workstation waiting for additional inventory to arrive.
Jeff, most supply chain people don't like the word inventory, so.
You're right. Thank you. Although this show, if you have none, you can wait. It is helpful, of course, to have a little before the bottleneck.
That is true.
And Hal, I'm sure you're going to correct us if our interstitial banter here goes off track from accepted theory.
Right. Or it's a node having congestion, so we need to move to the next node.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. I assumed that I might initiate a whole series of supply chain humor comments, which.
Hey, John, we can see you. Can you hear us?
I can.
Okay, great.
So should I start or?
Please do. Thank you.
Okay, well, before I start, I just want to introduce myself to those of you I haven't met. I'm John Young. I'm Commissioner Carl Bensel's counsel. Unfortunately, Commissioner Bensel can't be here today. He's unavoidably detained. He really wishes he could be here. This is an important group that we work with on data. And some of you, I look on the participants we've talked with and will continue to talk with, but we really wanted to give you an update on where we are with the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative, kind of where we've been, where we're going, and kind of what the next steps are and how we can collaborate with all of you. I'm going to try, Rich, you want me to share my screen? Let me see if I can do that.
Yeah, you should be able to share it, John.
Got it. Okay. How's that? Can everyone see this?
Oh.
Good. Okay, well, again, thanks for having me. Can you see, Rich, is this?
No, I can't. I can't see it.
Okay. How about now?
I can't see it. Anybody else?
No.
Do you want us to? I think we can probably throw it up there.
Hi, John. So are you clicking the share screen button at the bottom?
I am. Yes.
And you're clicking on the PowerPoint and that's not working?
Yeah.
We're happy to throw up the PowerPoint if that's helpful for you.
Sure. That might be easier.
Okay, give us 1 second.
I think we got it up, John. I think.
I mean, I'm looking at it right now, but I don't know if that's my screen or if that's the shared screen.
Well, I can see it on my screen. Jeff,
I can see it on my screen.
Okay, great. Okay, and just tell our Caroline when you need to switch to the next slide.
Okay. Will
Thanks,
do.
John.
Okay, so first slide, Caroline. So I just wanted to start, for those of you that we haven't talked to yet, the FMC's Maritime Transportation Data Initiative We're mission driven. The FMC, as many of you know, is an independent regulatory agency that has oversight over carriers, MTOs, ports, OTIs. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022 and the FMC put the FMC front and center. We have a mandate. We look at it as we have a mandate from Congress and the administration to work on this issue in particular and to move it forward. We're mission driven as an agency, so we're not kind of in the process of putting together a coalition or doing other putting other things together. We're basically doing what we should be doing anyway under our statutory oversight. What we're looking to do is provide a comprehensive and well-documented data dictionary, and then recommend data structures and standards that will enhance the movement and efficiency of freight. Next slide, please. So we set out to kind of look at the supply chain from front to end, starting with the bill of lading. We're working to harmonize data definitions, identify the data transmission gaps that will provide consistent data visibility and transmission to the supply chain. Next slide, please. Our project plan has been to build a baseline of data definitions and identify these gaps to really set a foundation. So once we have a foundation, once everybody can kind of plug into the same definitions, then it's our view that innovation can truly flourish. That means that you can plug in if you have a port community service, you can use these definitions to really kind of build and not only enhance what you already have, but also plug into other innovative platforms that might come along or that might be built. Next slide, please. So we've done extensive outreach to the stakeholder groups. We have included basically everyone from ships to trucks to railroads to MTOs to OTIs and everyone in between. Data has no jurisdictional restraints. In order for a healthy supply chain to work, it needs to be fed with good fleshed out data and visible and accessible to the supply chain participants. So basically, if you've shipped, moved cargo or scheduled cargo, we've worked with you. We've had you participate in our meetings. Next slide, please. So over the last 5 months, we've had 18 meetings with over 80 presenters. We've really tried to keep this structured. So it was our meetings were every Tuesday at 3. They were for an hour. We provided every meeting had the same questions. It was structured in a way that we just basically wanted to get a slice of the supply chain, understand kind of what that slice of the supply chain was seeing. So, our questions were, what data do you have? What data do you need? How do you share your data? What data do your customers want and need? And what platforms, if any, do you use? And also, what are the differences? How do you handle export and import data challenges? So as I said, we covered the entire supply chain, but we're also working closely with our federal partners. So we've had extensive meetings with CBP, USDOT. We are in contact with constantly. We have weekly meetings or bi-weekly meetings with them. Commerce Department, we have been working with as well, and then USDA. USDA has been kind of a very strong partner on this as well, because I think they're obviously one of our focuses, as well as data, is also the export. And USDA has been really invaluable really, and providing a lot of the work that they already have in place and to help harmonize data that's going the other way to exports. Next slide, please. So our 18 meetings really culminated into our June 1st data summit. It was intended to be a hybrid event where we would be in person primarily. Unfortunately, circumstances required us to make it an entirely virtual event. So we were, before we, and the reason why we did that is COVID numbers were steadily rising in DC, and we had to make that decision to, make it totally virtual. But before we did that, we basically had almost every participant agree to come here, fly to DC for this summit. We had 4 breakout sessions on key data elements, definition, standards, and transmission. Some of you who I think are on this call right now or on this meeting were participated as well. What we did is we kind of we started the questions at different times for different groups. So we made sure that all these issues were covered. So everyone didn't start with data elements. They started at different points. So we had good, robust conversations on these, on these issues. We have the notes. We've recorded all these. That's another issue point that I would like to make is that this has been a completely transparent process. We have made this, we recorded every meeting. It's on the FMC YouTube page. So if you have some time and you want to binge, we've got 18 hours of data discussion for people to look at if they so choose. But more importantly, we have these, people have had an opportunity to really see and hear what each industry has said and what their needs are. And what I've seen and what Commissioner Bensel has seen is that, a lot of times the people who are on the week before will watch again because they want to see what the next person or the next part of the supply chain is saying and doing. Part of it's probably, they want to make sure that they're, they want to know what the other guy's saying, but I think also it shows that there's an interest in understanding kind of what happens next. And, I think that's also kind of come through in a lot of the feedback that we get because most of our participation has been very, they've been very interested. Most of our participants have been interested and willing to engage. We are reviewing our recommendations right now and our comments that we receive on our website or individually. We do have a website on our webpage on our FMC website, the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative. If you were so inclined to go and look, we also post our comments, so you can see that as well. Next slide. So we are in the process of culling through all our comments, the meetings, and follow-up meetings. We're putting together recommendations as we speak. This is an ongoing process. I think one of our goals is to have something that we can work with not only stakeholders but the federal partners and industry on in the coming months. We are looking at the July 27th commission meeting as a potential first kind of glimpse of what we have. That may be aspirational. We may have an update, but we may not have recommendations that we'll have ready to share. But regardless, our goal is to have, our intent is to have our recommendations in front of the commission in September. But leading up to that, we will be discussing them with industry and federal partners. And the intent, really, just to emphasize this, is to have a national standard for data when it comes to maritime data. Next slide, please. And then questions.
Any questions, anybody?
I think Jeff Wilkie has a question.
Oh, wait, John, just for a second more, just to make sure there isn't somebody else. Okay, so kind of two questions, John. The first is there a mechanism for modifying the data schema that you're going to recommend? So, one of the things that I've learned over the last 30 years is that new sensors become available over time that allow us to do more things if you capture that data. If you have a rigid standard that can't be changed as new information becomes available, it's more difficult. So what's the mechanism for, once you propose a standard, for allowing it to be changed over time?
So, I think to begin with, what we're looking at is definitions, and making sure that, people are operating on the same definitions and expectations. So when you say standard, it's not like, I don't want to overcomplicate it. I mean, by saying that, there's going to be one scheme, this is not set, this initiative is not designed to put, like, whatever you call it, a schema or whatever, to that everybody has to follow. It's about putting definitions in place that everybody needs to follow. And it's about identifying data that's already out there, that's being transmitted, but isn't being captured, in an effective, efficient way and shared in an efficient way. So it's mainly operational. I think that, saying that we're going to have a rigid standard is not the way, is not correctly summarizing what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide a baseline, create a baseline that, people pretty much want to exist. They kind of are using it in some ways, but they're using it the way that they know how to use it. And what we're trying to do is kind of streamline the data, not only definitions, but how it's shared, so it's easily transmissible and transparent.
And the second question, John, is who owns the data after it's, who's going to kind of manage the system?
Well, we're not collecting data. We're basically laying out, the how the data is, the definitions, how it should operate. This is the data that we're talking about, is data that's already out there. When containers are released, early return, things like that, definitions. I'll give you an example. So this is the example I use when I put together all these meetings. If Jeff says an apple's an apple and John says an apple's an orange, it's still kind of, it's still fruit, but it's not exactly the same. What we're trying to do is harmonize, definitions that people are already using, but they may not be using it in the same way. So we're not out to collect data, or not trying to collect data.
Thanks, John. Super helpful, and thank you for the update.
Sure.
Any other questions for John?
So I answered everyone's questions, huh?
I think so. Okay, Jeff, should we move on to how?
Yeah, I agree. So, John, thank you again for the presentation and the work, and look forward to learning more over time.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for having us. And again, Commissioner Bensel, sorry I couldn't be here. We're happy to follow up. So please let us know if we can answer any more questions.
Hey, John. Well, thank you very much for filling in Carl's spot. Hope everything's okay with him, and I appreciate you stepping up.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, John.
Take care.
So we'll now move to our subcommittee report outs. The first up is the Data Innovation and Technology Subcommittee, which is led by Hal Lee. So Hal, I'll embarrass you just for a second and do a little bit of a bio. So Hal is the professor of Operations, Information, and Technology at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. His area of expertise include research on global supply chain management. He focuses on global trade, global logistics, value chain innovations, digital technologies, business models and entrepreneurship, sustainable and responsible supply chains, and inventory management. Rebethi, the word inventory is in the bio. He obtained his PhD in operations research from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania in 1983. So I'll ask Hal to report on the subcommittee's progress. Hal, we're really honored that you took the subcommittee leader role. And as this subcommittee is still developing concrete proposals, this area, as you've, I think, learned from both the summary on flow as well as the Federal Maritime Commission summary, this data area takes a lot of work to get right. So we won't have a vote of the full committee on any recommendations at this time, but we'll get an update from Hal, and then there's further work by the subcommittee. Upon completion of Hal's remarks, he'll accept any questions that the audience has, and then we can move, Rich, if there are no further questions at the end of Hal's talk, to the break if it's early.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeff.
Hal, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Jeff, for the very warm introduction. And good day, everyone. First of all, I want to also express my gratitude to be given the privilege to serve. And I also have learned so much through the process from my fellow subcommittee members, as well as the other subcommittees and many, many people that we have consulted with through the process. So as Jeff has mentioned, we are still doing the exploration stage. I don't think we need to have a slide presentation, actually, so I think it's easier for me to just talk through it. So Caroline, thanks very much. We are not ready to give out recommendations because there are some ideas that are forming, and we will have to continue to refine them and specify them well. And I hope that in the next round, we'll be able to give also concrete recommendations similar to the other two subcommittees. So what we have done in the last few months has been mostly, number one, first, having a very, very comprehensive scan of how either industry people as well as third-party independent agencies, and also similar to what Andrew described, flow projects, what they have been doing in collecting data and using data. So the second is more needs finding. Needs finding would be talking to industry people and also some government representatives as to what kind of needs they saw in data. And the third one would be then some forming ideas on how we should go about helping the American competitiveness in the supply chain when we develop those data. So my first point I want to make is that there are two things that I want to highlight first. One is when we talk about data, it should be logistics and it should be manufacturing, because I think American supply chain competitiveness depend on both movement of goods, freight, which is one of my fellow subcommittee is looking at, and second, manufacturing, which is also the other subcommittee looking at. So manufacturing and transportation, freight, logistics together form the supply chain. So we are looking at both. So we're not just looking at logistics, we're also looking at manufacturing. Second, what we have discovered in talking to many industry representatives is that increasingly many leaders in industry, top manufacturers, top logistics companies, they have internal teams. They have lots of researchers and excellent people to mine data, to make use of data. Of course, they still want more, but I think that to most of the SMEs in America, they do not have that capabilities. So we must think about how to help them. When we talk about improving Americans' competitiveness, it's not just improving the top 5% companies in America. How can we support reshoring? How can we improve America's overall competitiveness? We must think about the SMEs as well. So as a result, some of our budding recommendations would be also to look at what we can do with the SMEs as well, in addition to helping the top Fortune 500 companies to strengthen their competitiveness. So now let me comment on logistics. Logistics, we have a very good head start, as you have been informed by the presentation by Andrew on the flow project. So there have been many sessions that we have conducted with some of the early work done by like MIT Lincoln Labs and also with the Flow project team, we also have heard multiple, maybe already independent agencies that collect data already in existence, collecting truck data, maritime data. So the key for us would be more, okay, what can we do as a subcommittee to add to already some of these very powerful initiatives that they have a head start? So of course, we do not need to duplicate that. We don't need to duplicate, but we should figure out a way to enhance those initiatives. And here are 4 things that I want to comment on, what we can do to make the enhancement. So our work going forward would be mostly to create the design specification and also to help the validation experiments to enhance a project like Flow. So Flow to us is actually a building step, a building stone for us to continue our initiative on data in the logistics and freight movement domain. So number 1 is, I think, from the questions that Willie made, and I also follow up on his questions, we think that when we look at flow, which is transportation and freight, we should look at a node and we should look at the dwell time between nodes. So at a node, which it could be a terminal, it could be a rail station, it could be a warehouse, a node carry a lot of data. And how can we create the right data standards in order for companies to contribute data so that we know a lot about the node, what's happening at the node, how many containers are waiting, what is the utilization, and we can create indexes like what Andrew described. So that's what happened at a node. But between node is something that we would like to also help to specify. What kind of data do we need to collect between nodes, which is the dwell time part? So we need to know nodes, and we also need to know dwell times to complete the picture. So that's one thing. The number 1 thing that we look at would be to try to design those specs. Second, I think we triggered by Barbara's very good question. Barbara earlier asked a question about, can we do predictive analytics on top of those data? And I think Andrew started off by saying, well, we come up with indexes, and we hope that the individual companies would create their own performance measurements and make use of the data. That's very true. When we talk to many of these companies, we recognize that those ability to make use of data so as to make it into intelligence, to be useful data, the ability varies a lot. Some companies are very mature and sophisticated, and they recognize this is how we can make use of data. No problem, we can mine the data. If flow is mature, we'll be able to make use of those data and we'll be able to complete the picture. But the majority of them have asked, maybe there should be like Department of Commerce or Department of Transportation as a third party to generate a first level of statistics. What could be that first level of statistics? The mean, the variance, or something descriptive statistics that would be informing about how this node is performing, why bottlenecks are budding up, and so on. So I think this is important. Now, to that end, of course, statistics require us to have more comprehensive data. So I think Andrew described that in the beginning, Flow is focusing on containers, on ocean. And Barbara already asked whether we would expand it to rail. In fact, trucks are also equally important. The truck dwell time from one location to the other, those data exist, but merging data is one thing. Making sense of data is another thing. So we would try to define the specification to help to create that second layer, which is what kind of statistics can sit on top of data. Simply because most companies do not have the capabilities to, when you give them data, They need help. And so once we have the statistics generated, I think they can continue other means of selecting route, selecting carrier, and they can do a lot of things following that. But let's help them by generating the second layer, which is the basic statistics. That's the second point that I hope we'll be able to help going forward. The third one is what Jason mentioned. And I think Andrew already mentioned that we should move to similar to the aviation area of doing more collaborative decision making. I think that's exactly, we call that sense and respond. Data is the sensing part. We want good sensing. We want more data to enrich our sensing. And we want the statistics to help us to do intelligent sensing, smart sensing. But after sensing, we have to do something. Okay, and that is the response part. And Jason has identified, helping us to say, hey, sometimes sensing help us to identify a bottleneck, help us to identify a disruption. What should we do? And the doing part could be to inform the right maybe federal agencies or the right path to trigger actions. For many, many corporations, that action plan, some of them know what to do. I am a large corporations. I've faced many disruptions before. I have action plans and I know exactly what to do. It's very similar to, I learned from the International Red Cross. International Red Cross says that if there's a disruption, you gave us enough data, we know what to do because that's our life. That is our profession. We know how to activate. But for most companies, what should be that path? What should be that good best practice point? So we think that maybe this is one area where this subcommittee, instead of duplicating what Flo here does, is to create a playbook of what should be done as the response part of this sense and respond, because combination of sense and response is how we can make good use of data. So that's the logistics part, yeah. And the fourth part that I want to comment on, Flo, is that Andrew mentioned about indexes. I think that's very good. For SMEs, I think we need help. They need help, okay? So what to make sense out of the indexes? Okay, indexes, a consumer price index is very clear. We know consumer price index shows us the pricing trend, but many of these logistics indexes, maybe we need to help to educate most of the industry participants. What do those indexes mean? How can we make use of those? I think there is a need for education and training so that when the data is mature and complete, the large segment of the industry can benefit from it. So these are my comments on logistics. Now let me turn to manufacturing. In manufacturing, the data problem is of a different nature. Most of the companies found that they are vulnerable to something called the bullwhip effect, which all of us, we have read about these days. If you look at the media, there is not a single day, almost not a single day where the bullwhip appears. The bullwhip appears in transportation industries, in the garment industries, in the baby powder problems, in sanitizers, in everywhere, the bullwhip. 25 years ago, when I published my first article on the bullwhip effect, I thought that the problem was clear-cut. And after 25 years, we should not have any bullwhip. No, bullwhip is still alive, yes. And my colleague, Willie Shi, has been trying to educate industry on how to handle the bullwhip. We all need to. And he and I are the academics that we haven't done a good job in the education. We still need to have a long journey to go. What is a bullwhip? It's mainly because the manufacturing sector has limited view of what is going on. We don't have the aggregate picture. And so we are acting on our own. We're acting on our own, and that led to distortion of data. So now data has been distorted. the information distortion is amplified, magnified, and so make it even harder and make it very difficult for us to make the right capacity decisions. So what can manufacturing do? It turns out that there are now some industry initiatives, and I was part of some of these industry initiatives, talking to them, and they recognize the problem, just like what our subcommittee recognized. They were ahead of us, and they said, we have to do something. So we don't count on perhaps the Department of Commerce to create an industry view of what manufacturing is happening, and there's so many industries anyway. So one of them, and I was allowed to mention their name, is something called True Demand. True Demand is what the semiconductor and high-tech electronic companies with OEMs, with distributors, with semiconductor companies, with contract manufacturers, they formed a consortium. They said, let's experiment. Let's do something to contribute data, very similar to flow. The participants would contribute data on what? On shipments, on inventory. Yeah. Inventory data is still useful, even though we don't like it, but if we want to have visibility of inventory, orders, forecasts. And by aggregating data, protecting individual companies' proprietary data, we'll be able to inform the industry on the aggregate trends, the total. And the benefits are twofold. One is that you would not be fooled by the bullwhip. You would not be misled by the distorted information, so that you don't count on those distorted information and build more inventory or build the wrong capacity. So that's to avoid being fooled. And second is that maybe industry as a whole, when we have the aggregate data, will be able to invest in the right capacity to reduce the need to have more bullwhip, to reduce the urge by companies to have those bullwhip. So this is an industry initiative, and we are embracing it. We think this is great. In fact, they are looking at one sector, which is electronic, high-tech, and semiconductor. There might be other critical industries that we can use them as an experiment, learn from them, we'll follow them, and maybe create similar kind of initiatives led by the Department of Commerce to say, hey, we should need to have an industry level view and visibility of how demand and supply situations are. So this is what we think would be useful for us to strengthen manufacturing. Yeah. Of course, similar to the logistics side, if we are able to create this kind of macro view of aggregate data, we also must help the SMEs to learn how to make use of those data. Because I think leading companies, large contract manufacturers or leading semiconductor companies, this would be beneficial. And once you provide that macro view with them, they would be more intelligent. They would be better and smarter in managing their planning, managing their inventory plan, production build plan, and capacity investment plan. But for a small supplier, and we need to also help them to coach them as to how that can be done. So to summarize, I think we will continue to build design specs and also helping out to map out what could be the full recommendations to build the logistics. I call it the logistics monitor, which is the flow with a turbo engine on flow, building expanded flow kind of project, building this second layer of statistics to increase the intelligence and also to educate, building the playbook to complete the sense and respond. So that would be what we would focus on to complete our recommendation on what that logistics monitor should be. There should be a parallel to manufacturing monitor. The manufacturing monitor, maybe we can leverage some of these industry initiatives like True Demand, which is already ongoing, to help them maybe provide guidance to also build the design spec and also build some statistics, intelligence statistics to say, hey, how can we weed out the distortion going on? How can we avoid the bullwhip data so that we don't be misled by the bullwhip and build even bigger bullwhip? You magnify the bullwhip if you don't create some intelligence to sanitize the data, then by just passing aggregate data on, then there is a potential that we are actually building even more bullwhip and hurting the whole industry. So we have to build that. We have to do that design spec. And with the lesson coming from perhaps electronic and semiconductor industry, we can then inform how other critical industries can also do something similar. There is a third step that we are undertaking, which we're at a very early beginning stage, which is, if you know our name, the subcommittee's name is Data, Innovation, and Technologies. So we've been focusing almost all our attention to data, but we don't want to forget innovation and technology. Innovation and technology would be, there can be advanced technologies that also can help American competitiveness. When we want to improve Americans' productivity in manufacturing, when we want to do more reshoring, it should not be just reshoring the labor-intensive industry in the emerging economy and bring it back to the US. We do not have the same labor force that can support it. We do not want to just duplicate that manufacturing process. We want to improve the process, and that process can involve advanced technology, both the right use and also to avoid the misuse of advanced technologies. How can we do that? Especially for SMEs who also do not have 100 PhDs at their companies to make use, or technical people to make use of advanced technologies. We don't want them to blindly follow others and copy and use the wrong technologies. They need to use technology with the right workflow integration. This is the third element that our subcommittee to look at past June 29th, because we want to make sure that we don't forget the innovation and the technologies. So my final comment is to say, we look at three things. We will continue to work with Flow to turbocharge the logistics monitor. We will build the manufacturing monitor, making use of leveraging some of the industry consortium that is ongoing, and begin almost like on a blank sheet of paper, how can we enhance American competitiveness in the use and avoid the misuse of advanced technologies to improve our productivity. So, Chairman, I finished my formal update and welcome any questions and comments and inputs from my fellow members. Celise?
I think we have a question from Liz.
Yes.
Hi there. Since no one else was going to ask a question, I figured why not? From a worker's perspective,
yes.
I found your presentation fascinating, and of course, you were talking about this notion of a playbook. With regard to the doing part, triggering actions and a sense and response kind of approach, and obviously, as a worker representative, we are the folks who are on the ground, who see the work day in and day out. And we're trying to figure out a way to get a worker voice and perspective upstream in the development of technology, in the use of data, and how it's factored into decision making. And so I just wanted to, I guess, just put a pin in it to say that we think that a worker voice and perspective could be very useful to your subcommittee's work. And often we aren't thought of in the data game and in the use of technology until after the fact. That
Liz, I think, did anybody else lose Liz's audio? Yeah, Liz, we lost your audio for a second, for about the last 20 seconds. We try again. You're talking about making sure that workers have a voice in the data and technology area.
Yeah, I guess I'm sorry if I was not clear. Just this notion of workers being utilized when technology is developed and then implemented versus upstream in the development. And certainly when you're talking about the use of data and getting perspectives on efficiencies and how data can be used, I think a worker voice and perspective would be useful in that subcommittee's work.
Elise, this is a very good point that you brought up. In fact, when we talk about the introduction of advanced technologies, right? So introduction of advanced technology is not just an automation. It is not as simple as that. We definitely need to involve the workers because the workers need to be first upgraded, potentially. They need new skills, new capabilities. But second is that we also have to take account of the potential impact to them. So would it affect their health or would it affect the safety in the work itself, right? When you introduce a new robot, just an example, right? So advanced technology must involve how to work with the workers as well. Now, when we talk about the sense and respond, the respond part, and I think you're right, is that and initially we thought about management response. So management is to say, hey, what can we do when there's a disruption? I call up which senator, or I call up the Department of Transportation, or I call up my supply partner. That's important. But I think if the response requires us to move from one warehouse to another warehouse, it involves workers. And we have to also recognize that the workers have lives, and you can't say that everyone come back to work at night. Yeah, we have to respond. Yeah, well, of course, there might be the necessary thing to do, but I am totally in agreement with you is that the voice of the worker should be there. So we'll make sure that this is something that we'll bear in mind in our subsequent work of the subcommittee. Yeah.
Thanks, Liz. Willie?
This is going back to the flow stuff again, but listening to some of your comments, one of my questions is, the flow stuff is kind of static supply demand at nodes, okay? And what I'm wondering is like the temporal granularity, how much time granularity do you have at the nodes that you're going to measure it? And where I'm going with that more specifically is, will I have rate data? Okay, and it then becomes particularly interesting if I have rate data. Let's say I'm going from Ocean at LA Long Beach as a node into rail, okay, and I have rate data, because then out of that, because between say output rates and inventory and throughput time, if I have two, then I can solve for the third, and then I can start estimating, for example, dwell times. Okay, so my question is really around, how do you think about granularity and rates? Okay, and do you maybe think about, vectors to additional nodes?
Yeah. Well, I think really you're right. First of all, you mentioned rate, which exactly that several of the companies that I talked to, they mentioned that don't focus on just physical flow. So I think when we think about logistics, most of us think of logistics, right? It's a container, it's a truck, and the physical movement, but also think about the other informations that are related to the physical flow. And rate was mentioned more than one time, because rate could be a signal about how the trend is going to be, and the rate could be the freight rate, as well as the labor rate, which I think, to Liz's point, is that the labor rate also is an indicator of the potential congestions and bottleneck. So I think we should collect that. Yeah, it turns out that how micro do we want to get, which is something that Andrew mentioned about at Flow. They don't want to get too micro a level. They want to have a higher level. It turns out some groups have already collected some fairly micro level data. And I'm thinking about the trucking industry, which Jason introduced me to Atri, they already have very micro level of truck movement data. So the key for us is, well, if some existing data is already at the micro level, why not? Yeah, we use it. But if the data has to be assembled from scratch, then maybe we should start with some higher level data. So this is what we need to define as the spec, the design spec, is that to what level of the micro level. And to your point is that don't just focus on physical flow data as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, because, you know, the problem I've always found with aggregation, I understand the purpose of aggregation is to get anonymity in it and so on, but the purpose of the aggregation is like, sometimes, I mean, I think about this every time I look at import statistics, right? It's like, I wish more, it would be a lot more useful if it were more granular, okay, and more micro level, right? So, but that's one of those tensions, because it then becomes harder, of course, and can become edging closer to proprietary, right? So it's one of those tensions, but it's just a thought.
Yes, well, one of the companies that I talked to, and these are very large now, type of like iconic logistics company, and they mentioned that exactly that when we have aggregate data, we can have the example of like a human health. So if I have aggregate data, I look at myself and how you're overweight. So, which is true, yeah. So you're overweight, and so that is an indicator on the aggregate level. Well, why am I? Did I eat too much? Did I not have enough exercise? Or did I have some other ailment? Actually, something wrong with my internal body mechanism, metabolism. Now that requires micro data. The micro data enable us to try to understand the causes of the problem. Aggregate data give us symptoms, which is useful still. Yeah, you need to know. Okay, yeah, I think you seem to have a certain ailment because your skin color changed. So that's a symptom. But we need additional data in order for us to go into understanding the cause and effect. So ideally, we have micro data, but I also sympathize with Andrew's position on flow, is that, well, that is a lot of work to start. And maybe we start with something manageable. My point, our point is that if micro data already exists, we assemble them. If we have to collect from scratch, we start baby steps forward to have aggregate data with the goal of going down to some level of granularity, which allow us to do cause and effect analysis. Okay, but thank you for bringing that point, Willie.
Hal and Willie, if I try to stitch together this conversation with the question I asked about throughput, it seems to me perhaps that the granularity that we would focus on first should be the bottlenecks that we desire to have in the system. And if we can get detailed data on those, we can at least know whether the bottleneck is where it should be or has moved somewhere else. So for example, if I was thinking about the ports of LA and Long Beach, and Gene and I have talked about this, I might really want to know what the capacity of the cranes are, because that's probably where I'd like the bottleneck to be. And I'd love to know what the utilization of cranes are.
Yes.
And you know, the obvious answer for why cranes aren't 100% utilized, you know, turns out usually to not be the right one. And that'll allow us to drill, to your point, Willie, to drill into the rates. Why is the rate of throughput through the cranes less than we expect it to be?
Yeah, but this is the classic problem, right? Which is the bottleneck is not where the obvious place is, right? And maybe it's at the distribution centers who can't receive the containers.
Yeah, you need more, I would say, micro data in order to understand the obvious bottleneck. It turns out it's caused by something else, as Willie said, and to be able to trace that back, that's very hard. Yeah. One also comment that I want to make is that one of our members in the subcommittee mentioned that sometimes we worry too much about, or of course we worry about insufficient supply, especially in manufacturing. In manufacturing, we always say, well, where are the shortages? Sometimes oversupply can be a problem too. Yeah, so if we have oversupply, because oversupply means that like the food, too much food is going to be perish. It would hurt the farmers. It would hurt their income, and then we're putting wastage. It could potentially damage a particular sector. So I think both. Our view is that maybe our obvious attention is the bottleneck, and the obvious attention would be shortages. But if excessive oversupply, it may have some consequences, and then we should also take note of. However, we don't know, and so maybe that is the kind of playbook. Maybe that's the kind of informing industry. Okay, what are the things that we should look for? What are the statistics that will be crucial, and what could be the potential trigger point where you need some action and the collaborative decision making, which is the term that Andrew used. Yeah, thank you.
Hao, we only have about a few more minutes. Are there any other questions for the Data Innovation and Technology Subcommittee? Well, as is evidenced by this discussion, this is a very complicated area. Hao, thank you for your expert guidance along with the rest of the subcommittee in leading us through the pulling apart the pieces here, and we look forward to the next, obviously the subcommittee work in between, but the next full committee report out. Thanks, Hal. Rich, should we adjourn for a break from now until 2:40 Eastern?
Yes, that would be fine. 2:40, pretty sharp. And you may just want to leave your Zoom spots open, so you don't have to get back in, but that's up to you. But yep, 2:40, we'll be right back at it. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.